It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. And today we come to you live from the green space with lots of politics, real and fake. We will talk about two dynamics in the Democratic presidential race, the gender-scripted trait of likability, and what makes a candidate catch fire on social media, what they call internet-y smarts, and how representative is that? Also, our Trump Inc. team has a take today on the 10 years of Trump tax returns data that the Times just published, and a certain Mar-a-Lago bar tab paid for by you. You will hear about that today. And New Yorker humorist Andy Borowitz brings the news that's so funny because it could be true from the Borowitz report later in the show. All that coming up, but our lead guests here in the green space today are WNYC City Hall and Politics reporter Brigid Bergin and Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board, who used to be a City Hall reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Daily News. They are here on Mayor de Blasio's 58th birthday, a day when he is not announcing a run for president. Hi, Brigid and Mara. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
I don't see any candles. You didn't come with candles.
We could sing if you want.
It's up to you. Brigid, we can tell people that behind the scenes, we knew you might have to cancel on us this morning because if the mayor announced a presidential run today, you would have to cover it. Why were people thinking it could be today?
So there's a couple reasons. I think going all the way back to the beginning of the year, the mayor has been sending out signals pretty clearly that his interests lie in a more national conversation about progressive politics. And then more specifically in terms of organizing a campaign, he set up a PAC last year, and staff from that PAC has been actively working to help him get out and spread that message. And we were hearing, a lot of us in the press corps, that this would be the week. Our friend Anna Sanders from the Daily News even reported on Friday that this was going to be the week. And then on Monday, Mayor de Blasio was on New York One, and when asked by Errol Lewis whether or not this was going to be the week, said no, in fact, it was not the night and not the week, and so we all sort of hit pause. And that came after some staff shakeup that happened with that PAC last week. Someone who had been working for City Hall, a guy named Mike Casca, who had moved over to work on the PAC. He was an alumni of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. He decided to both leave the PAC and his duties at City Hall entirely. So we are in what seems to be a little bit of a reconfiguring phase for the mayor. I think those of us who were pretty certain that we were on the verge of an announcement now feel like we're still likely on the verge of an announcement, but we're in maybe a little bit of a holding pattern.
Mara, I never thought he would do it on his birthday, even though there was speculation, because it would make it look like he was about, celebrating himself as opposed to serving. But well, you have a skeptical face.
It wouldn't have been a good idea. Maybe I'll leave it at that. But
right. And this appearance on New York One where he said he's still deciding and will not announce a decision either way this week at all, 22 other people have figured it out by now, or is it 21, and jumped into the race. Others, like Michael Bloomberg, have considered it and announced that they would not run. What's your best understanding of the delay for de Blasio one way or the other?
Well, I think, this is a mayor who has a tough enough time making a decision about what to do with a sanitation announcement or a housing announcement. So the idea that he's struggling about whether or not to run for president as a long shot candidate, frankly, is unsurprising. I haven't looked at any internal polling or anything like that, but I think it's safe to say that it would be a long shot announcement. Now, look, you look at the current state of affairs, I think a lot of politicians out there see President Trump and they say, well, why not me? And that's hard to argue with. But it is an issue, I think, in part of, if you're the mayor, do you want to run for president, even if you likely won't win?
And Brigid, I see that the mayor just unveiled a new health care card to connect 300,000 uninsured people in the Bronx, I think all in the Bronx for the moment, with primary care providers. The mayor says he is building universal coverage at the city level. Can you remind us of the context for the card he unveiled yesterday?
Sure. So this is the next phase of an announcement he actually initially unveiled in January. It's part of a program called NYC Care, and it's a program that is intended to help folks who are either can't afford or undocumented to access medical care and to keep them from going to emergency rooms, but instead ensure they get primary care. And there has been a little bit of debate about whether or not this actually constitutes a form of, insurance, healthcare insurance for these folks, or if this is really more of a way to market some services that the city already provided and give people, more awareness that they have access to it by giving them this card. Making sure people go to see their primary care doctor is a good thing, and ensuring there are more primary care doctors that people can go to is a good thing. And that's part of what this program will do. These cards are going to be rolled out starting in the Bronx on August 1st. So we still aren't quite to lift off on the program, but it is part of this program that, when the mayor initially announced it, he announced it in an article in the Washington Post. So again, this is, that signaling that he was giving us back at the beginning of this year, that his sort of was setting his sights on a more national stage for some of these policy conversations.
He's running for mayor of D.C. That's what you're telling us, right?
Exactly.
It is a good precursor to announcing a presidential run, though, right? While we're waiting for a federal system, I brought universal coverage to the biggest city in America. Would that be a fair claim, Mara?
Well, no, I think the city's Health and Hospitals Corporation has been around a very long time. It's certainly fair to say that this is a mayor who came to office promising to address income inequality and specifically help poor New Yorkers, and that he has dedicated more money to this system to shore it up. So it's not hypocritical necessarily. I think it's just an issue of what's really new here. And, I don't know that the cards that he's touting provide a new entitlement, if that makes sense.
And I think part of what we see him doing here in terms of his communication strategy is he is taking advantage of some of these policy announcements to get onto a national stage. But one of the challenges when the national stage is often also right here in New York City is some of those same reporters who have been covering you in City Hall are now the reporters who are also part of that national conversation. And so I think back just a couple weeks ago during when it was Earth Day, and we were talking about some of the newest announcements related to his, and the city's Green New Deal, he went on Morning Joe, and he was going to have a conversation about, the city's plans to limit emissions from city buildings. And as opposed to having Joe Scarborough conduct that interview, he turned to his left, and it was our old friend John Lemire, AP reporter, now covering the White House, asking some of those questions. And unfortunately, the conversation went from just talking about the mayor's, unfortunate for the mayor, the conversation was not just about building emissions, but it was also about, well, do you think your policies for the environment are consistent when you drive 11 miles from Gracie Mansion to the Y every morning to work out?
In Park Slope.
In Park Slope. And that's the type of conversation that is, going to dog him no matter what he does, because some of those same reporters who have been covering him in City Hall are going to be covering him wherever he goes on the campaign trail.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, it's the Brian Lehrer Show live in the Green Space today. By the way, when we're in the Green Space, you can watch us as well as listen. We're streaming live video at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. Our first guests are WNYC City Hall and Politics reporter Brigid Bergin and Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board, where she writes about things local and national, but she also used to be a City Hall reporter when she was at the Daily News and the Wall Street Journal. And this is Mayor de Blasio's 58th birthday today, so we're talking about why he's not throwing his hat in the ring for president this week, as a lot of people expected he would do, and related things. And listeners, we can take your phone calls at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Do you want Bill de Blasio to run for president? How do you think he's doing at running the city, or anything related, or if you want to ask our guest a question? 212-433-9692. 9692. I'm curious, Green Space audience, we have, secret ballot in the United States, so you don't have to raise your hands or not for this question. But how many of you here are willing to say you voted for Bill de Blasio for mayor at any time? So that's a lot of people. Of you, how many of you think he should not run for president? The laugh you hear, ladies and gentlemen, in Radio Land is that the exact same number of people who raised their hands saying they voted for de Blasio appeared to raise their hands and saying he should not run for president. If any of you are willing to say out loud how you square those two things, I'd be curious to hear it. So raise your hand if you want somebody to come around with a mic and say why, if you voted for the guy and maybe voted for the guy twice, maybe even think he's doing a decent job as mayor, do you think he shouldn't run for president? So if anybody's willing to do that, we've got people with microphones so we can come around. And listeners, same question for you if you want to call in, 212-433, WNYC, 433-9692. Mara, there's a piece in the Times, let me find it. I thought I had it here, sorry. But there's a piece, okay, so I'm going to have to paraphrase this headline, but it's something like, as de Blasio weighs mayoral run, he's dogged by ethics questions.
The cloud.
The cloud, an ethics cloud, thank you. Can you, and it's both about the past and about the present. Can you talk about the present aspects of that?
Sure. So the mayor right now has been raising money for this presidential run or would-be presidential run with something called the Fairness PAC, which is a federal PAC. And he, in doing so, has been taking and seeking donations from people who are doing business with the city or hoping to do business with the city. There was, in particular, one case where we had a Boston developer who held a fundraiser for the mayor last month, and that developer is looking to expand his company's footprint in New York City and has just recently hired a former senior de Blasio official. So, by federal rules, I actually don't believe that it's not necessarily a legal issue. I think that there's certainly an ethical issue here. I mean, you really don't want the mayor kind of giving special access to the city and its contracts and its riches, really, to people who are donating to his campaign. And this has been an issue that has dogged him for years with other PACs and other entities, fundraising entities that he's created.
Now I found that headline, ethics cloud hangs over de Blasio as he weighs presidential run. And he and I have gone back and forth on the show over the last few weeks on this. Here's one-minute exchange from last Friday when I asked about the report in the news organization The City that showed how close the link was between donors to his possible presidential run and their lobbyists asking for things from City Hall. This starts with my question. City news organization used the example of the law firm of Abrams Fensterman. In the fall of 2018, two partners wrote 3 checks to your PAC totaling $15,000. At the time, they'd retained 2 lobbyist firms, Brian Cave and Suri Kasara, to influence the office of mayor on zoning changes that could significantly impact their real estate clients. So if your deputy mayor or commissioner meets with those real estate lobbyists who might be hired by your donors, the public shouldn't have any concerns about that?
No, listen to what I'm saying. I really feel like I'm being very clear here. I'm going to say it again. The public has a right to know, and unlike any previous administration in the city, we are giving you that full vision. Now, where I come from, Brian, that's something that people in the media and watchdogs should say, hey, that's great. Because you're obviously, if you're very comfortable showing us exactly who met with who, then you must not have anything to hide, and that is the truth.
So that was on last Friday's show. Brigid, you can react to that content per se if you want, but I'm also curious if this weeks-long story here in New York comes up when he's visiting early primary states.
So I have not yet gone with him when he's left New York, and if he leaves New York again, I most likely will. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this story, and it reminds me of the 2017 mayoral campaign. These issues are complicated, and they're hard to translate to a broader audience. The notion of raising money in exchange, a pay-to-play environment, makes sense. But when you start getting into the details of it, it is not necessarily the issue that when you're sitting across from someone at a diner in Iowa is necessarily going to be at the top of the issues that affect their life. And so while I think that it's our job to raise these issues in terms of holding the mayor accountable, we didn't see it have any impact on his 2017 mayoral campaign. Some of this type of scrutiny was happening throughout 2016. He was under multiple investigations while he was never charged with anything. When the Manhattan DA's office and the U.S. Attorney's office announced in a very unusual move that they were not going to charge him, it was with what was essentially a scold to say that he had violated the intent and spirit of the law. So, these are conversations that have been happening, and they have not necessarily moved voters to this point.
And I could see, Mara, how there's a broad disconnect. Tell me if you think there is, and I don't know if you've gone on any of the trips with him, but between de Blasio's press coverage and interaction with voters out there versus here. Because here I feel like we talk about campaign finance and NYCHA and homelessness and Rikers and rezoning, and none of that even comes up when he's talking out there, or am I missing it?
No, that's right. I mean, look, all politics is local, right? So if you've had a mayor for a term and a half, essentially years, everyone in the city is going to have some complaint about him. It could be a street light, which, we hear those folks call into your show often, and I love that because it really keeps the mayor humble, I think. Or it could be about his affordable housing plan or his pre-K plan working or not working the way people want it to. So that's not going to translate to a national audience, and I actually think that's part of why the mayor, understandably, has so much more fun out on the campaign trail. I mean, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
Let's take a phone call. We're going to go to Alice on line 3 in Park Slope. Alice, you're on WNYC. Hi there.
Hi. Thanks for answering my call. I'm really pleased. So, yes, I've been a lifelong resident of Park Slope, and the mayor lives or did live right near me. And I can say that people here dislike him intensely. I can't think of a soul that I know who would vote for him again, except for the fact that he's a Democrat.
But wait,
and in New York, as you know, Democrats win.
May I ask?
So there's no one to vote against him.
Did you vote for him twice in the general election?
I voted for him once.
First time?
Yep.
And did you vote for him in the primary that year too?
No, I did not.
Right, okay. And do you think it's just for you as, a one-person focus group convener in Park Slope, do you think that a lot of people who've gotten turned off to him were fans, thought he was doing a good job early on, anything like that?
I think there were some, but I don't know if you're aware of the fact, but Park Slope Patch, which is one of these local paper kind of things, has reported there's a sign in his gym saying that no member here should run for president.
Right. Yeah. Somebody put that sign. Alice, thank you. Who put that sign up in the gym? Brigid?
I don't know if we know who put the sign up.
It's just a protest. It's not the gym itself.
No. I mean, and I will, to piggyback a little bit on what Alice said, a few weeks ago, I went to Park Slope on a Sunday and reported a story the same day the mayor was actually out in Nevada, stumping with voters. And I went into it, I will say, with this, having talked to friends and advisors of the mayor's, and one of the things that they will often say is what the media misses about Bill de Blasio's success in the past, the fact that he's never lost an election, is that he has a relationship with voters that is not reflected in the coverage that he receives. And so I said, okay, let's go out and talk to the voters. Let's go to Park Slope. Let's go to his neighborhood hotspots and find folks who must help me understand what
Right.
that relationship is.
But it might be that was the wrong spot, actually, even though he lives there. And I'm going to further that thought by taking line 10, Jose in Woodside next. Jose, you're on WNYC. Hi.
My call. I voted for de Blasio, and I will always vote for the man because I really think, even though I had doubts when he first started running for office, I really had a lot of doubts about it. For all of the reasons that everybody talks about, the doubts that they have, I had the same doubts. But over the years, I've come to trust the man's word, which is different from what's reported. And as a consequence, I would not want him to run for president, only because as difficult as it has been in New York for him, with the press, it would be even more difficult in Washington. And you can even accomplish even less in Washington, I think, as a president. And then the public is so fragmented and so divided, and I mean, you talk to 5 people, they'll tell you 5 different things.
You don't want him to run for president
because
because
they never agree on anything.
You just don't want him. You want to protect him. You want to protect him from all that aggravation of being
Absolutely.
president.
I think he can do better with his life than waste it on because I think it would be a waste.
For you, what's the best thing or best 2 things that he's done as mayor?
I think he has brought the city. Bloomberg brought the city together a lot. But I see, after Trump, he has done a tremendous job of bringing the people together because there was this divide between the whites and the minorities in New York after Trump. And I always see it because I look at people and I see how they react to me. And that reaction tells me a lot about where their heads are at any given moment. And I ride the subways all the time, so I see what's going down. And over the last couple of years, I've seen it change back to what it was before Trump.
Jose, thank you.
And that, I think, is all because of
de Blasio.
De Blasio.
Thank you very much, Jose. We appreciate your call. And Mara, you wrote a column in February about the mayor starting to campaign in places like Iowa called Mayor de Blasio, Where Did the Love Go? So that was about the flirtation with higher office coming as he's getting less popular here at home. But you also do note in that piece part of what Jose was pointing out, which is there's a big racial divide in New York City about Bill de Blasio, which is why his mostly white neighborhood of Park Slope might not be the best place to gauge his popularity as opposed to other neighborhoods.
Right, and that piece was essentially about the mayor cheating on the city of New York. Because I joke about that, but, I think something that my colleagues and I missed, at least early on, was the amount of hunger and, in some ways, even just desperation and then later relief that was felt among Black and Latino New Yorkers specifically. Just hearing the mayor of the city of New York, whoever that be, speak to them as full citizens of the city and full constituents. Putting it into context, that was not done under the Bloomberg administration for a dozen years, or at least lots of people felt that way. And I think that Mayor de Blasio really does communicate with Black voters better than any politician I've seen on the national stage other than Barack Obama. I think that's probably his greatest strength. I've written about it before. It's super interesting. His numbers have fallen among Black voters as well as other voters, but that connection did get him through the 2017 re-election campaign. And I think even if he hasn't always delivered, in my opinion, for those voters the way he promised, I do think that other politicians should kind of look at that and take some lessons.
You just said he connects better with Black voters than anybody other than Barack Obama that you've seen. You mean including other Black politicians? I
would agree. I don't want to say it's Barack Obama and then Bill de Blasio necessarily, but I do think that he's really up there in the way he's able to communicate.
So I can see, Brigid, where his people could make a case for why he would stand a chance in the presidential race based on that some of the white progressive favorites like Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are having trouble getting Black support, according to the polls, and are working hard to build that credibility in communities of color. Bernie's doing better than in 2016 from what I see, but it's still an issue. De Blasio's base in New York is African American. He's in a mixed family. He's from the progressive wing. in addition, and he created universal pre-K, universal primary care, paid sick leave, and a $15 minimum wage. So in theory, he could conceive of himself as a fusion candidate. Is that part of the rationale?
I think tomorrow's point that he has had a history of being able to, and successfully talking to Black voters and brown voters in New York City in a way that certainly Mayor Bloomberg did not. In my own reporting, before I did the Park Slope story, I also, or I can't remember the order, but I also spent a lot of time at the National Action Network conference where he was also speaking, and the audience
Al Sharpton's group,
right, and the audience for that is a largely Black and African American group of very engaged voters, and I was curious to see if in that type of audience, if you would start to hear people who are a little bit more open to the candidacy, to the possibility of a candidacy.
And many, many, many of these presidential hopefuls came to speak at that conference recently.
Many of them. And the day that Mayor de Blasio was speaking, he actually was speaking just before someone who's not running, but who is really a dynamo right now, Stacey Abrams, candidate for governor in Georgia. It was one of those moments that was really striking to me because a lot of what has become part of the stump speech for Mayor de Blasio at this point, some of the lines that those of us who cover him regularly have heard many times, talking about how there's enough money in the world, but it's in the wrong hands. It fell in a very tepid way in this room because the energy there was, they were waiting for Stacey Abrams. People wanted to hear from her. So while I think it is true that he does connect with Black and brown voters better than some other politicians, I'm not sure if in this field at this moment, if he is the right messenger. And that's also what I've been hearing from other analysts who've looked at this race.
We have a question here in the green space. Hi there.
Hi there.
Go ahead.
I have a question, which is, so I happen to love this mayor. So I'm coming from a different perspective. The first election, my hometown paper told me not to vote for the mayor because he had a lot of dreams and they would never come to fruition. It was a waste of a vote.
What was this hometown paper?
Oh,
Queens Chronicle, the Brooklyn Eagle? What was the hometown paper?
The New York Times.
I've heard of it.
And without enough information, I went that way, and immediately these pie-in-the-sky dreams came true, saving me $18,000 a year in childcare. And I happened to have friends deep in the administration who would report, who I saw working with great integrity, beautiful people, who could tell me that the mayor had true values that reflected our own, was a deeply ethical person. And I began to see the news reports in a very different way, always missing the facts. So I'm not actually personally tied in any way to his candidacy or, probably would not vote for him amongst this field of wonderful candidates the Democrats have. But I don't hear any facts, and not a single fact, to be honest, to say this mayor is unethical, this mayor is, any of the things that we get impressions of. Yes, he takes a car 11 miles, but shouldn't we, I feel like on your show, Brian, last week, Brian McKibben was saying, let's forget about turning on and off the lights here.
Bill McKibben,
the
environmentalist.
Let's focus on national and international policy changes, because we're beyond that. And here we're spending a lot of time talking about whether this candidate isn't the best candidate in the world, while we have a field of wonderful candidates who can also support, or, of course, the opposite is happening at the White House right now. So is there any one fact that we can say, hey, this is a bad mayor? And if not, can we just drop it and say he's a man who is entitled to go to his gym, to run for president? And you know what? He's done some amazing things. He truly believes that everyone should have affordable housing. And he has focused his energies, it seems to me, on creating policies that jibe with the values and ethics, I would guess, of everyone in this room and everyone listening. That's my guess. More or less. It's many.
Many in this room. You
much
don't
of it.
know.
So it's a lot of berating without real facts. Just like he lives in our neighborhood. He's one of us. Come on, just lower your expectations a little bit. Be perfect in some way. That's totally unattainable.
I'm just curious for you, besides if you want to apply for communications director, I think you do better than a lot of people out there in the professional field. Is it your sense, among other people you know personally, that their support for de Blasio has declined over the course of his terms? And if so, do you think that's driven by media narratives that they're consuming, or just ways that he's coming across to them? Or what's your own sense of whether people you know who voted for him at the beginning too line up with where you are now, and if not, why not?
There is definitely a media narrative. You cited a headline earlier. That's, again, one of these speculative, it's sort of name-calling without any basis. To answer your question directly, the enthusiasm has waned. The guy is not the world's best communicator. He may not be the most organized person in the world. These are inherent flaws for him that may stifle his national ambitions. But I feel like as New Yorkers living in a city, we have all these problems all the time. We wish it were better. It's easy to see a headline that says, there's some question about corruption, so he's a corrupt. Let's move on, without any basis.
So keep our eye on the ball of what he's actually doing. Thank you very much for your comment. I really appreciate it. We're almost out of time. Mara, in your article in February, Where Did the Love Go? It came just as the problems in NYCHA public housing were most in the news, and President Trump's appointee for overseeing NYCHA, Lynn Patton, was beginning a month's worth of sleeping in NYCHA buildings to immerse herself in the people and their living conditions as the mayor was starting to spend more time out of town. And you wrote, if the mayor isn't careful, New Yorkers might seek comfort elsewhere, too, like, say, from Lynn Patton, the Trump party planner turned regional housing administrator, who, from the looks of it, is available. Now, as it happens, Lynn Patton was on the show yesterday to talk about NYCHA and being a Trump supporter. I asked her about the court-supervised consent decree with the city that requires the city to spend only $2 billion more over 10 years and no requirement for more federal spending, despite NYCHA's estimate that it needs $32 billion to really make those buildings decent again. And here's what she said.
That pursuit should not be partisan. We should all want to know what the accurate capital needs number is. A lot of politicians, I won't name them, but a lot of politicians, a lot of private developers, they tell me that number is ridiculous. They tell me that a lot of that number has to do with union wages. It's not okay. First of all, that number also breaks down to about $181,000 per unit. You try going up to your private landlord tonight and telling him you want him to invest $181,000 into your apartment, and let me know how that goes for you.
So who should be making less?
Well, I know for a fact the Federal Monitor has asked for a list of everybody at NYCHA that makes more than $150,000 a year, and unfortunately there's a lot of them. We are going to be making determinations about where the money is best served. We owe it to the taxpayers, we owe it to the residents. And again, this is not a political thing. I would hope that everyone would want to use this money wisely.
Lynn Patton on yesterday's show. Mara, you wrote a critical column about the lack of federal dollars when that consent decree was first agreed to in January. What did you think about that answer and Lynn Patton questioning the realness of the $32 billion figure and throwing a dart at the fact that a lot of people make over $150,000 who work for NYCHA?
I mean, look, the city and cities across the country have gotten a raw deal from the federal government on housing and public housing for years. This is really nothing new. It's also certainly true that the city can probably cut down on some expenses and probably needs to more fully rework its labor agreements to get some of those costs down in NYCHA, which is the city's public housing authority.
And did you mean, were you just being cheeky in that piece, or do you think she's actually interested in running for mayor in 2021?
I was being cheeky.
Okay, just making sure. You never know. And Brigid, before you go, you broke some news recently that led to a change at the Board of Elections. You revealed that anybody could look up any registered voter's home address.
Yeah, so voter registration data is public data, but it was always public data that you had to go and get. And because of state legislation that moved the primary date up and all of the assorted issues with candidates that came along with that, the board decided that their quick fix was to just put it all up online, which they did, and where it lived for about a month, more than a month, for a while, until actually a listener tipped me off to it because he was checking out his neighbors. And when I went, so when I went and looked at it, it was striking to me because, we've done a lot of reporting on voters and voter data here at WNYC, and this was definitely a break in policy, a change in policy. And when I asked the board why, their answer was that the printer was not going to be able to print the books in time. And so that we could just go down a whole rabbit hole, looking at that kind of answer. But ultimately, after the story went up, and then the New York Times also did a really good follow-up piece, the commissioners had a conversation, and I think they were getting some blowback, and they decided to take the information down. It is still a public record. You can still go to the Board of Elections and look anybody up, and you can still go and buy a copy of the voter roll. You just can't be sitting in your bed at 2 o'clock in the morning snooping on your neighbors.
And Brigid deserves a lot of love and respect, because it's not often that a journalist gets a change in policy that quickly by pointing out something that can be threatening. And she's also the person who broke the story in 2016 about thousands of people in Brooklyn who thought they were registered being removed from the rolls before the Democratic presidential primary that year. So they changed something after that, too. So on that note, please thank WNYC's Brigid Bergin and Mara Gay from the editorial board of the New York Times. Thank you so much. And a lot more to come here in the Green Space. Stay with us.